All right, so we are live here today for Migrant Women Reality Watch number 16. With me I have Rachel Moran. Thank you so much, Rachel, for taking the time. First of all, I know it's pretty complicated on a Sunday, so thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us today. My name is Adriana. I work for the European Network of Migrant Women, but I'm also the co-coordinator of Radical Girls, and this is the capacity that I am in with today. I may or may not have corona, so bear with me if my speech is a little bit confusing today. I'm trying really hard. But yeah, today is the European Union Anti-Trafficking Day, and we thought it would be a good idea to invite you so we can talk a bit about the linkages between trafficking, prostitution, and pornography and the sex trade in general. So I'm going to dive right in because it's already 6. Our first question would be that a lot of women know you as the best-selling author of the book Paid For, My Journey Through Prostitution. But I feel like there's some details about your public life that are missing or were not made general to the public. So I was wondering if you could tell us more about yourself, about Space International, which is the survivor-led organization that you have founded. So yeah, a little bit of a presentation if you would like to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for struggling through your possible COVID to do this. I had no idea you were feeling unwell. The first thing I would say is that at this stage now in 2020, things are in a very different place than they were nearly 10 years ago when I founded Space. And we're very fortunate in that the survivors wing of the abolitionist movement today is absolutely huge compared to what it was a decade ago. It's much bigger than Space International. It's absolutely all over the globe now, and it's something that I'm not sure if I could have foreseen it back then, that it would have grown this robustly in this shortest span of time. But it has, and that's an amazing thing to see. There's so many different individuals and organizations speaking out now, you couldn't possibly keep track of them. But what we did back in the early spring of 2012, well, it was actually in the September of the previous year that I had first sent out flyers trying to catch women's attention in Ireland, women who'd lived prostitution, because I wanted to organise alongside other women, because I knew that I was coming towards the end of writing my book that had taken 10 years to write and another year to edit. That was published in early 2013. And I just knew that this couldn't be, the message that I was trying to bring couldn't be one woman's fight. It's not one woman's oppression, so it's not one woman's fight, you know. And I really knew that if we could gather together a solid crew of women, didn't matter how small, just that they were solid and that we were all on the same page and present what we had to say to the Irish people, I knew that we could create social change and legislative shifts. And we did that. And it was very early on, though, in the process. It was still in 2012 when I begun traveling internationally, and I met lots of women from all sorts of places. And the thing that struck me really forcefully back then was that all of these women, and it didn't matter whether they were Black women from the United States or, you know, Indigenous Canadian women or European women, we were all saying the same thing. So I knew that there was this thread, this commonality to all of our experiences. And you saw it across all sorts of different intersections, race, class, ethnicity. It's everywhere, and prostitution is something that the prostitute population, rather, are people who are almost always drawn from the most vulnerable social groups. And I knew that if we could present this in the form of a visual, women sitting alongside each other from all sorts of different places and backgrounds and saying the same thing, that it would be very impactful. So that was how what was originally conceptualized as Space Ireland broadened out into Space International within the space of the first year. So that's how we came together.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, as a young woman myself, and as part of a young women's movement, we are the European Network of Migrant Women Young Women's Movement. We wanted to ask some questions that would be maybe a little bit more specific to young women, and maybe we could show this interview to young women who are not really yet decided on the issue of prostitution, or at least that is my wish. I don't know if it will come true or not. But we know that here in Europe, a lot of young women they grow up under the pressure of knowing that, or believing that prostitution and pornography are actually empowering, and it could be a job just like any other, and it could be something that young women enjoy. So maybe as an opener, I would love to ask you if you could create a course on women's human rights, specifically targeting young women. How would you define what is prostitution and what is pornography, and what kind of materials would you have in this sort of syllabus or course for young women? Mm-hmm. What do you think young women need to hear or need to know when it comes to the sex trade, and more specifically prostitution and pornography?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's actually about half a dozen questions there wrapped up in the one question, and they're all really good questions. They're very relevant. So I'll do my best to cover them. The first thing I would say to young women is that my heart absolutely goes out to you. It really does. Because what we were dealing with in the 1990s, and I got into prostitution in 91, the culture of that time, and in my life leading up to that, you know, mid-80s, late 80s, early 90s, those would have been the ages when I was between about 8 and 15 years old. What we were seeing culturally, I know this is unimaginable to young women today. I'm only 44, so it's not like, you know, I'm an absolute dinosaur, but the world is progressing so very quickly and in the wrong direction on this issue, for sure, that women are dealing with something now that's very different to what we were dealing with in the late 80s, early 90s. Back then, there were kind of, you have to remember, MTV was a brand new thing. There was no such thing as the internet. There was no such thing as mobile phones, never mind smartphones. So the point of all of that, all of these different things have come together to present the young women of today with an absolute barrage of images. Young women are surrounded now in a way that we never were. There were hints at that time on MTV of the idea that being sexually available to men, you know, all across the board was in some way positive, sexy, fun, empowering. Those hints were certainly there. And I most definitely picked up on them, because I remember the actual day that I was forced walking down to my first red light zone, having this imagery in my head, thinking about, you know, Madonna in her Desperately Seeking Susan film, you know, like in fishnet tights and black patent leather and shiny, you know, and all of this imagery that was connected to the idea that you were powerful if you were sexually available. That was definitely there. But it wasn't stated specifically and drummed into our heads and communicated to us in all of the ways that, as I say, young women are surrounded today. So I think that's the first thing I'd say to young women, is to be aware that you are utterly surrounded by this. That's the first thing you need to be aware of. And I tell you now, when a woman opens her eyes and begins to observe the messages that are being pumped at her all the time, she will not be able to unsee these things. You can't do a U-turn and go back from that into the kind of naive and innocent ignorance that a lot of young women are in today. They don't see these things as dangerous and pernicious and pervasive because they've always been there. You know, they've grown up with smartphones and, you know, tablets and laptops and the constant intrusion of the social media world into the real world. So that's the first thing I would say. The next time you're in a supermarket, look at the magazines, look at the imagery. What is it saying to you? And then as you go about your day, you know, regardless whether you're interfacing with the real world or the intrusion of social media, you will see different variations on the same theme, and you will see them all the time. So that's the first piece of advice I'd have. And I'd also say that we, all of us young women and middle-aged women like myself, we need to respect our elders. And that's something that I don't see us doing often enough. Because there are women who've come before us who've written extremely important texts. Mm-hmm. And honestly, if I had read, I'm not sure when Sheila Jeffries' The Idea of Prostitution was actually published. I think it might have been during the 90s. But I can tell you, had I read that book before I got into prostitution, I wouldn't have gone near prostitution, you know, because it lays out so very clearly the dynamics of what prostitution involves. I would say get yourself into a situation where you're not an easy person to be duped, you know. I've listened to interviews with pimps online, and one line that particularly struck in my mind was when this former pimp was explaining to these other guys who were listening to him all about, you know, the pimping game, as he put it, and how it worked and all this. And the line that stuck with me was when he said, you have to remember not every woman is pimpable. Right? And I was thinking, oh yeah, they would be the women who have their acts together and see you coming before you arrive. And how I wish I had been one of those women, you know. So, you know, this is something that takes effort, you know. It's something that you have to actively work towards. And, you know, most of us, like, we don't go through our lives thinking that we're going to have to fend off the intentions of somebody who wants to exploit us in that way. But women need to be aware that there's no shortage of people out there who want to exploit you in that way, because there is no shortage of men whose demand for female strangers' bodies creates that marketplace. So just to give yourself a good solid ground in the world around you and in the way that you are positioned in it. I have another couple of books that I really think women ought to read by older feminists. Janice Raymond produced a book called Not a Choice, Not a Job about 5 or so years back, and it was a really important piece of work. Also, Julie Bindel, just a couple of years back, she published The Pimping of Prostitution. So all of these books, and Kathleen Barry, of course, she's written a couple of books, Female Sexual Slavery, and what was the second one? I've read it. The title won't come to me now. The Prostitution of Sexuality. That was her second book. And that's actually a really important book. It's a very delicate, intricate kind of an argument. And I think those 5 books certainly should be on every young feminist's reading list.
Mm-hmm. From what I take of your answer is a great deal of feminist analysis and women that came before us have helped you reach that conclusion. So I think one of the materials that definitely needs to be on this sort of curricula, if we ever were to create one, and I'm sure, for example, Fiona Bradfoot, she has told me this in a previous occasion in the Brussels call here. She told me that feminist analysis and authors is one of the way to prevent so many women from being pimpable, as you said. So thank you for that. So yeah, today we are the 18th of October is the European Union Anti-Trafficking Day, and we think as feminists, but mainly as abolitionist feminists, that it's very important to to state the linkages that exist between trafficking, prostitution, and pornography. We know that the campaigners that are pro-sex trade really go great lengths to explain and educate us on the fact that these are separate, isolated events. So I wanted to know what do you see the relationships are between these two elements, trafficking, prostitution, and pornography, and how would you respond to these people that say that we should never conflate them because they're separate issues?
Well, my first question, if I was speaking to an academic who made that preposterous assertion, would be whether or not they were actually silly enough to believe that, or whether they were willfully lying, because it's got to be one or the other. I was having a chat with Fiona Broadfoot myself recently about exactly this, and she said something that really made me laugh. She said, I just can't get over that these people who are allegedly intelligent, and that just got me laughing. And it's a great couple of words to pair together to describe them. They are allegedly intelligent. The links between prostitution and trafficking are so bloody strong that these things are inseparable. So first of all, what are the links? The links are that the same pool of men is buying them, for one thing. I heard a feminist, or I read rather a feminist's words years ago, and I wish I could remember her name because it's always bothered me that I can't quote her when I repeat this. Anyway, whoever she was, she had said that to look at trafficking and ignore prostitution was like looking at the Middle Passage and ignoring the plantations. And that really was a remark that crystallized the situation very concisely. And I think that, when people try to pick these two things apart, it always just bamboozles me how they can even say that. Because look, if you're in a building, does it matter whether you got in the back door or the front window, or you drop down the chimney like Santa Claus? You're in the same building. What are they talking about? I personally know a woman who was dragged off the streets of London physically by the hair of her head and dragged into a vehicle and taken to her little flat in London, where they collected her passport and flew her to Galway in the west of Ireland, where she was prostituted north and south of the border, all across the island. The very same men were buying her as would have been buying me had I been prostituted at the same time, which I wasn't. The very same pool of men create the demand, or create the marketplace rather, with their demand. She was being violated by strangers daily in exactly the same way. She was having the same sexual demands made of her. And actually, it takes a lot to move me to the point of tears when I'm talking about this issue now, because I've done so much talking about it in public and in private, and I've done so much thinking about it when I was writing the book that took me so long to write. But I was moved to tears when she said to me, "Don't ever think, Rachel, that I viewed the women who'd gone into prostitution any differently from myself, because we were all living the same hell out there." And that was very, very moving to me, because I think it wasn't really until she said that and I reacted emotionally in the way that I did that I realized afterwards, thinking about it, that maybe that was always a secret fear of mine, that women who had been trafficked into prostitution in that classical sense of the word, in a way that absolutely met the legal definitions, that they would look on us as somehow dirty or different for having allegedly chosen to be in the situation. But she understood perfectly, because she'd been surrounded by women who were shoved by the circumstances of their lives into prostitution. So there are certainly, strong push factors, and she recognized them for what they were, and she recognized the fact that the women didn't want that any more than she did. So, for the academics who make that argument, I would tell them talk to Anna. She might be a better person to hear from than me.
Thank you. It's hard to listen to these things and keep asking you these questions, but I think it's very important for other young women and women in general to hear it. So thank you again for being here and taking the time. I don't know if you know it, but I'm based in Brussels, and here in Brussels we have the equivalent of the red light district. Although not a lot of people in Europe know this, we actually have a lot of street prostitution, but we also have this area in Brussels where women are exhibited in window panes and in shop windows, just like in Amsterdam and other Dutch cities. But very ironically, it's also the heart of the European institutions. So you can really see the contrast here in Brussels of the ideals of the founding fathers of liberty versus the reality that women are pushed towards too. So prostitution here in Brussels and Belgium is kind of seen as inevitable, whereas in other countries it's seen as something acceptable and even a kind of work. From another side, we also have all the UN agencies, the private foundations, NGOs such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and even LGBT groups and even some so-called feminist associations saying that it's either inevitable or acceptable, as I was mentioning before. But despite this, I perceive, and we perceive in Radical Girls and from the European Network of Migrant Women, that there's an increasing acceptance of the Nordic model and the abuse that the women in the system of prostitution are subjected to. I wanted to know what kind of work do you do to raise awareness towards the Nordic model and towards the atrocities and the violation of human rights that really occur in the system of prostitution. How does Space International or yourself raise awareness on the facts and evidence that surround the system?
Well, we draw on our own personal experience to lay out the reality of what prostitution involves before people. And that's what we've always been about. And, I was thinking about, I struggled a lot on and off throughout the writing of my book, but whether or not to put my own name on it. And I just knew that I had to. I just knew it would be a lifelong regret if I didn't. And I think that there's something very important in that, in witnessing, and I believed then, and I still believe, that prostitution has persisted for as long as it has, because so many of us have been frightened into silence. It's not that I'm any less frightened than the next woman. It's just that I'm not prepared to be directed by that fear, It's been a very terrifying time in lots of ways. There's been a lot of bullying and threats and abuse and all sorts of stuff like that. And, but I feel that we have to just keep on witnessing. We have to keep on talking about the reality of what this is. There's never been an oppressive system collapsed anywhere in the history of the world without witnessing what it is to live it from the inside out. So that is the reason for that. I'm sorry, your question was a bit more complicated, and there's a couple of bits of it that kind of slipped out of my mind. Do you want to put anything else to me?
No, I'm actually happy with your response, and I think the viewers will be too. There's some points that you addressed that I want to address later, so I think we will come back to it anyway later. There's a quotation or quote of yours, I don't know which word to use right now, that deeply impacted me. And I've had this quotation sent to you because actually a lot of radical young feminists in France have been putting this quote of yours all over France and tagging it on buildings, and I was very impressed by it. And it's a statement or a response to a statement that was made by the Human Rights Watch director when it was said that prostitution would be a means to combat women's poverty. And the sentence is, when a woman is poor and hungry, the humane thing to do is to put food in her mouth, not your dick. And this sentence really spoke volumes to me, because I think it's a really good example of the class system that exists in Europe, and how working class women and girls are really relegated. And when I say relegated, I really mean forced or pushed towards the sex trades. From the European network's point of view, we know that the overwhelming majority of women and girls in prostitution are migrant women, here in Europe at least, from outside and inside of Europe. So I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit on the condition of working class women and girls, and how come so many of them are in the sex trade. It is surely not a coincidence for me.
Well, like I was saying earlier on, what we noticed early on in space was that whether or not we were marginalized on the basis of class or race or ethnicity, or all three taken together, you always had at least one major vulnerability in a social sense. Now, there are middle-class women in prostitution, and in every case I ever came across, they were women who had been abused in childhood or adolescence. So their sense of their own sexual selves was fragmented before they ever grew to sexual maturity. I've never come across a case of a woman who I got to know personally who was higher up the socio-economic ladder significantly than myself, who got into prostitution without having that as a feature in her history, right? So it doesn't matter whether the vulnerability is a deep internal thing in your own history, or whether it is a social reality in your life. Prostitution is always preceded by some form of vulnerability, some form of negativity. And I think that should be a pretty good clue that there's something very wrong going on here. So, you know, the other piece of your question, you know, what was that like, I guess, from what I saw of it. In our lives, people have to understand what Ireland was in 1991. Ireland has changed so radically in the last 25 or so years that if you weren't in that place in time, you wouldn't have a sense of the Ireland that I knew. I was born in 76. So in 1991, when I was 15 years old, Ireland was as white as the driven snow. Everybody was white. There was no racial hierarchy because everybody was the same colour. Our divisions were very old, historical, still are, of course, and they were class-based, which was pretty much an inheritance from British colonialism. Ireland is a very, very heavily class-divided society, although many of us might not like to say so. And it's a difficult thing to acknowledge and confront, but it's certainly a reality. We lived our lives in little silos, separated from each other. So much so that I remember when I was about, I would have been 13, and I remember getting a hold of this little pamphlet, like a little magazine. I was between schools at the time. I was often between schools because my mother had an unfortunate habit of taking me out of one school and not putting me into another one for a couple of years, so that there were very large gaps in my education. And I was needing to go to secondary school. I was 13 at the time, and so I had this pamphlet anyway, and I was reading it, and it was an advert, you know, for a private fee-paying school. And I just couldn't believe this school. I mean, my God, there was horses, there was music lessons, there was, fabulous big library. It was just like a school straight out of a fantasy. And I didn't know there was such a thing in the world, So it wasn't just that we couldn't afford to go to a fee-paying school. It's that we were so removed from that part of reality that I didn't even know at 14 years of age that there was such a thing as fee-paying schools. I'd never heard anybody mention it. So anyway, of course, that didn't end well because I gave my mother the leaflet, and her response, it wasn't even in words. She just kind of sniffed, snortled down her nose and, flung it sideways. But so that's just a little snapshot of how polarized we were, the Irish middle class and the disadvantaged working class. So it was no surprise to me at all then when I went into prostitution that all of the women and girls that I was coming across regularly on the streets and in the brothels, they were either girls I had known coming up through the care system, because I had left home just immediately after I turned 14. And so they were either girls who I'd got to know in the hostels, or they were friends of girls I'd got to know in the hostels. So they were, as a population, not just drawn from the disadvantaged working class, but drawn from the most vulnerable families among that social group, where there was a huge contingent of us who'd been in state care. Because alongside of being socially disadvantaged, we were also from particularly vulnerable families where there would have been addiction or violence or incest or whatever it was that drove us out of our homes when we were just out of childhood, and not even out of childhood in a lot of cases. So back to that same point we made earlier, it's about vulnerability on top of vulnerability. And I saw that everywhere I looked in prostitution. So that would be another thing that I would put to these academics. I would want to know if prostitution and trafficking are in no way related, and the only vulnerable women are over here in the trafficking camp. And then you have all the happy hookers over there in the sex worker camp. Well, why were those women's histories so damn miserable?
Mm-hmm. Yes. The pro-sex trade campaigns goes great lengths to sustain the myth of the happy hooker. And it also tries to shy away from, they really don't like the word victim, because when we talk about vulnerabilities, when we talk about the past traumas of women in prostitution and how it's really a continuum of violence, it doesn't appear out of nowhere. They tend to tell us, and especially survivors, that you are further victimizing women. And I think their argument has worked wonders for younger women, mostly because we don't want to be seen as victims anymore. We want to be empowered. We are our bodies, our choice. My body is mine. I do whatever I want with it. So I think it's just a massive leap from reality once again.
I would say to any young woman, and I've said this before, if you have a sense of your own physicality in that way, if you truly believe my body is mine, I'll do what I want with it, well then a brothel is the absolute last place that you should ever be, because it's not you who gets to choose what's done with your body in a brothel. It's the man who's buying you. Mm-hmm. It's the absolute and complete and total opposite experience that you have in prostitution. You are routinely stripped of any right to frame your own sexual boundaries. And of course you'll try to, because you couldn't psychologically survive if you didn't. But for every time you try to, men will press back against that. And they do it all the time. And they do it in a lot of cases because they get a sexual buzz and pleasure from pushing against your boundaries. So you're in an absolute cesspit if you're a woman who wants to enjoy the autonomy of her own body. And every woman on the face of the planet wants to enjoy the autonomy of her own body. Who doesn't? You know, it's so rage-inducing to me that there is this idea that there is some cohort of women for whom a sense of bodily dignity is not necessary. It's not, that reality itself is pulled inside out for a subset of women. And funny enough, like we just said, they're women who have been harmed and damaged and brutalized by life circumstances, by social structures, and by individuals, usually male individuals. So it's preposterous, and it's so counter to the facts that it's either an idea put forth, like I said, by a liar or an idiot.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to connect to something that you were speaking before about abuse of women who successfully exited the sex trade and but still continue to suffer abuse, mainly from these campaigners, but also from civil society that doesn't give them the space to speak out. I know that in Latin America, for example, the women who speak out against the sex trade, most of them have to wear bulletproof jackets in case of any attacks in the street. So literally just looking out for your own livelihood for speaking against such a monstrous trade and organized crime. I wanted to ask you about your defamation case. In case you want to talk about it, of course. We know that when you exited this industry and when you finally were able and wanted to speak out about what you and so many other women lived in prostitution, you went through a defamation case. So I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on that and explain to our viewers what was that about and how did you come to it?
First of all, I'd like to address what you said about the women in South America, and I know that for a fact. I know that to be true, and your heart would just break for women who have to walk around with bulletproof vests on in order to try to collapse a system in which they've been brutalized. I know a frontline worker myself from Mexico, and she's had to do all of that. And this is just for running a service that provides, different things to women who are trying to get out of prostitution. So, I think in ways there was a great naivety involved in what I did when I was writing that book. I'd spent 10 years writing it, and in the final year that I spent editing it, so it was 11 years all in, I did a lot of reading in that 11th year. And that was when I came across writers like Sheila Jeffries and Kathleen Barry, etc. And I wove some of their work into mine and quoted them here and there. And really what I felt that I was doing, Adriana, was just telling the truth. I just felt I was telling the truth. And I was. But what I didn't really realize was that to tell this particular truth, was to confront an entire system. I wasn't aware of the enormity of the political nature of the act that I was engaged in. I don't know what's going on here. This is just, can you still see me?
Yeah, I can see and hear you.
Oh, grand. I don't know why that happened. Just a new screen popped up in front of me and it looked like you'd gone. So yeah, I didn't understand that at that level. I knew a lot of people would be angry. I knew a lot of people wouldn't want to hear this. And I sure as hell knew that anybody who was profiting from pimping and prostitution or in brothels and escort agencies and on street corners buying women, I knew none of them were going to want to hear what I had to say. And I knew that there would be great anger from those quarters. But I had no idea that that the ferocious kickback that came from some other quarters was going to be so hard. I never saw, for example, the academics coming. I didn't realize academics were that stupid, to be honest with you. I genuinely didn't, you know. I mean, you shouldn't need a fucking degree in anything to know that prostitution is damaging and harmful. It should be enough for you to know that you don't want to see your own loved ones in a brothel. And they all know that, believe me. So yeah, I didn't really get it at the level that maybe I needed to get it in order to be able to anticipate the onslaught that I got. And what amazed me was, you asked about the defamation case. What amazed me at the beginning of all of that, because the rumor began to be circulated back in February of 2012, which is when I had begun blogging at the same time as putting together Space International. And I spent about 14 months blogging under the pseudonym Free Irish Woman, because my son was still a teenager at the time, and I wanted to buy as much time as I could for his sake. So I didn't want my name out there until the book went out. But in that 14 months that I was blogging, the internet was just hopping with people accusing me of being a fantasist and a fraud and a fake and a liar and all of this. They didn't even know who I was, you know what I mean? So it was absurd and bizarre. When we gave evidence, myself and the other women I was organising with in Ireland at that time, we gave evidence to a committee of Irish politicians to put forward, you know, our statements about what we'd lived and what we wanted to see happen legislatively. In the 1 second before the live stream was turned off, there was a photograph captured and circulated before my name. They were rabid to get hold of that information. You know, who was I and all of this. And that was really the start of it. The rumor was circulated that I had never been in prostitution in the first place, that I had been paid a 6-figure sum to produce that book, and so on and so forth. There were so many lies told, I wouldn't even know where to start. My home address was circulated in front of a large audience of pimps and punters. So now every scumbag in the country who'd like to harm me knows where to find me. I had to have my home put on the pulse system so that if an emergency 999 call comes in from my home, it triggers a response from the armed unit of the Irish police. So, you know, these are the ways that I've been treated in Ireland because of what I've said publicly. I'm not walking around, mind you, with a bulletproof vest on, so things could get significantly worse. But anyway, this went on and on and on, and it came to the point where I had enough of people that I would have thought should know better. Like I've had, you know, British civil servants, you know, published authors, well-known journalists, people of that caliber who have something to lose in terms of their own reputation. I've had people like that defame me on social media routinely, you know, for 8 straight years. So I eventually decided that that was enough, and that I was going to go to court to just to prove my case, which should have been proven already, by the way, back in 2016 when there was a documentary aired in Ireland and a short interview with a police officer who'd arrested me back in 1992. But that wasn't good enough for them, you know. They just had to keep those wheels spinning. So I got just absolutely sick of it, and I went to court and took a defamation case, and I won. So I don't know what they're going to come up with next, but it won't be that I wasn't ever in prostitution. We've settled that one legally now, thank God.
When did you win the case?
That was in November of last year.
Oh, it's fairly recent then.
Yeah.
Okay, and given this context, I mean, a lot of women who are successfully exited, and they want to speak out, it doesn't motivate them at all to put themselves out there and become like a public face.
Well, the amount of women who've contacted me privately, I mean, you couldn't possibly put a number on them. I've no idea at this stage how many, because it's happened so routinely. And said different variations on the very same thing. You know, I'd really love to do what you were doing. It's the right thing to do. I wish I could do it alongside you, but I can't because I'm married and he doesn't know about my past, or I can't because I have children and they're too young, or I can't because I have a job now and it would ruin my life, basically. And these are all good, valid reasons. I mean, women have their reasons and they're solid reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in my own case, I was really, really glad that, you know, my son wasn't like a little boy of 5 or 6 being bullied in school. You know what I mean? He was he was in his late teens and he had his wits about him by that point. So yeah, a lot of women do keep quiet. But there are different ways and lots of different ways that women can contribute to this movement, whether or not they've ever been in prostitution. For women who have been in prostitution and can't speak publicly, I would say there's nothing wrong with speaking anonymously, particularly if you're speaking directly to politicians. I would say send letters, send emails, go and meet your politicians privately. You know, people generally will have the decency to respect and protect your anonymity in those circumstances. There's lots of ways women can contribute. And another thing that I've been thinking recently is that, and this is on the back of some conversations I've had too with women down the years, women sometimes feel that if writing or public speaking is not their thing, then they can't see a space for themselves in this movement. And they're just absolutely wrong, Adriana. Honestly, one of the most moving things I've ever seen was a sculpture, you know. Whatever your own skills or talents are, you can find a way to bring them to this issue. So I would say to women, interrogate that and think about that, and think about what new and innovative ways you can find to bring something, your own unique voice to this issue.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about from the point of view of prostituted women, but how do you think that abolitionist feminists who have not gone through the sex trade, how do you think we can better support survivors?
Well, first of all, you know, what you said has just popped up this this thing that's been bothering me for a while now into my head. So I'll just say this. There is a horrible term that's begun to be circulated the last few years, non-survivor. And it's used to differentiate sex trade surviving feminist activists from those who are doing the very same thing without having been in the sex trade. But what I'd say to that is I've yet to meet a woman in this movement or outside of it for that matter who hasn't been brutalized in some way during her lifetime sexually, and almost always by a man or a number of men or a teenage boy, etc. There's really no such thing as a non-survivor in a world that's absolutely rampant with sexual violence.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a term we need to put in the bin and leave it there. So that's something that we can do for the women we organise alongside of who haven't been in the sex trade. As for the ways that they can support us, the first thing that comes to my mind is believe them. Just believe them. Because when I started speaking out initially, I could not fail but to notice that women who described themselves as radical feminists, they always believed me. And women who described themselves as liberal feminists, or as what later came along a few years after that, intersectional feminists, they almost never believed me, you know. And there's something terribly, horribly damaging and and painful about not being believed when you've had to really reach very deeply within yourself to tell a painful and uncomfortable truth, you know? To not believe a woman when she reveals something like this is then to just like spit in her face, you know? And so I think, you know, as far as what feminists can do for women who've lived the sex trade is believe them. And I don't mean to suggest that, you know, let me rephrase that. I think it's very important that feminists of all age groups treat us as equals. And by that, I mean, don't give a free pass to a woman to behave like an arsehole because she's been in a brothel. You know, don't do that. Like I've seen more of that than I'd like to see, quite honestly. And the reason that I find it insulting is because, like, I'll give you an example. Like, I just complete arseholery behavior. Put that into your mind, whatever it looks like to you. Because I don't want to be getting into saying anything that could, you know, identify people here. But I'd heard it said in response to that kind of outlandish, outrageous behavior. Oh yeah, but you have to make allowances. You know, she's been through a lot in this life. You know, and so I'm sitting there listening to this, and I'm thinking, so you're actually holding me to a lower standard of behavior because I'm being brutalized. Now, here was this woman trying to be compassionate, you know, she was trying to be, you know, a decent person. But it's a funny kind of backhanded insult, I would say, you know, because I'm perfectly well able to conduct myself respectfully. And so was the other woman in question, by the way. She just chose not to. So I'd say, yeah, don't infantilize women by, you know, holding them to a different standard. It's not helpful. It's not useful. It doesn't help anybody to move on either, you know. So that would be, you know, the thing to not do. And then prior to that was, yeah, to believe them. Those two things, believe them and treat them like equals.
Okay. And on the how scale, in terms of the Union, what could be done at legislative level to support the survivors of the sex trade?
Well, I think first of all, before we even get into talking about, you know, sex trade survivors, do you mean at the exit point when they're leaving prostitution, or do you mean in the aftermath, or both?
In the aftermath, a sense of insurance for those who speak out, to avoid situations such as the one in Latin America where women have to wear bulletproof jackets, or even here at the European level when abolitionist feminists are targeted in protests when they speak out against the sex trade.
Well, you know, that's a kind of a hard one. I think that all of our legislative processes need to catch up with social media. The problem with social media is that it has, it just popped up out of nowhere, and it flourished so quickly that it has outstripped and outpaced legislative systems. So, you know, if I go on Twitter today, I can get away with saying a whole lot more than I ought to be able to get away with saying if I decide to abuse somebody. You know, the person who spent years circulating the idea about me that I hadn't been in prostitution, she was breaking no laws, you know. There's nothing in law to protect against that kind of behavior. What was very, very strange to me throughout the legal process of the defamation case, by the way, I came to understand something that I'd never had an answer to until we were going through the court process, which is that she actually, to my astonishment, did believe the things that she was saying. she actually thought that about me. I had just assumed she was lying because, you know, I knew what she was saying wasn't true. So I assumed that it was vindictive lying, willful and deliberate. And the very strange thing to find was that it didn't actually start out that way from her point of view. But what happened was a whole lot of other people, by which I mean untold hundreds of them, probably thousands, had picked up what she was saying and circulated it and slung at me, and you know, and when it, you know, it just turned into this thing that was so broadly circulated that, you know, it was just, I'm sure, I know a lot of people believed that. I had multiple different situations where people would come back to me and say, you know, people working on documentaries and journalists and stuff like that, and whenever they would be asking questions, and these were like serious people, you know, people like I said earlier in academia and lots of other places where you wouldn't expect them to just repeat rumors like that. But anyway, so all of that can turn into a kind of a firestorm that's very, very brutalizing. And I think, you know, that's just my experience in my life, but I know that it's happening all over the place, all across the board, in many, many different situations, because social media simply hasn't been reined in. And I think that legislatively, we really need to get to grips with the way that we use these tools of communication that are really absolutely brand new to us in terms of the history of humankind.
Mm-hmm. And even sometimes social media gives us an even better context or panorama of what really is the mindset of people and what needs to be done to address that mindset, because I don't see any future on prostitution, anti-prostitution laws if we don't take the big force that is the public opinion. It's
oh yeah, I agree, absolutely, I do. I think that your battleground on this issue or any other human rights issue is always the court of public opinion. It really is, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I think, you know, you'd asked about what ways that the EU could influence, you know, in being helpful towards survivors in the aftermath of prostitution. I think there's a couple of different things I'd like to say about that. I think counselling, free counselling, ought to be available to anybody, woman or man, in the aftermath of prostitution. In my country, in certain instances, counselling is available for people who would have been abused, you know, like in residential care settings. So that's part of that package is access to counselling that's lifelong. You know, and some women will need that, and I'm not suggesting that, you know, they'll be rendered unable to function, you know, to the point where they're in the counsellor's office every day the rest of their lives. You know, most of us are not, you know, couldn't be described as emotional basket cases, you know, to that extent. But what I am saying is, if 5, 10, 15 years goes by, whatever, and a woman just really feels that she needs to talk, that support should be available there for her. And I think that that access to exit service supports when a woman is at the point where she's getting out of prostitution, that should be a statutory right. That should be a right in law.
Mm-hmm.
We shouldn't be just winging it, hoping that charities will, out of the goodness of their hearts, come along and support us. This should be a matter of statutory rights, and it should be state funded.
Mm-hmm. Everything that you're saying actually goes in accordance with the Nordic model on prostitution. But I also think, I mean, I have the impression that sometimes it's very hard to help women in those exit strategies, and a lot of women actually cannot get out of the sex trade, and then they are also further violated with the fact that if you can get out, it's because you choose to stay in a way. So what do you think could be done in terms of exit strategies?
There was a piece of research conducted by several researchers in Britain some years ago. I know Julie Bindel was one of them. So was Roger Matthews, who's recently deceased. There were 2 other writers, I believe, on the project, and their names won't come to me now. I wish I could remember the name of that book. But it was very interesting anyway, the research, when it was published. What it uncovered is that actually women get out of prostitution a whole lot quicker than we have thought, previous research has revealed, given that they have the correct supports. And that's the crucial piece. If a woman keeps on sliding back into prostitution over and over and over again, it's almost certainly because she doesn't have the right supports. I remember, at the point when I got out of prostitution, I had been an escort, and the rates back then were £150 an hour. Those were old pounds. It was before the euro came in. And I'll never forget, I ignored my first ESB bill because I couldn't afford to pay it. And when the second bill came, which was double the cost of the first one, the bill was £140. And I remember holding that bill in my hands and looking at it thinking, just 1 hour, I could sort this out in just 1 hour, And I would have had the change left over for a packet of cigarettes, I was thinking, like, if I didn't have to struggle with something as basic as an ESB bill, that wouldn't have crossed my mind. Now, I didn't do it, but I can absolutely understand how that happens, because when I got out, I just wanted out. I mean, I was just out. I just never wanted to see another punter's cock again, because I would have been, I think, and this reminds me of something I was talking to Julie Bindel about recently, because she's writing an article about Eileen Wuornos, so the American woman who murdered 7 men in prostitution. And we were talking about, the way that she has always been labeled, psychopath. I mean, the name of the film made about her life was Monster. It's really very crazy. And I said to Julie, if prostitution was recognized for the system that it is, if the system itself was identified in the way that it should be, Eileen Wuornos wouldn't be, she wouldn't be remembered as a serial killer, She would be remembered as a folk hero, And I don't think that there's, there's nothing heroic, I don't think, about murdering people, and I certainly wouldn't advise it. But what I am saying is that she was never categorized in the way that she would have been categorized if the system of prostitution was itself categorized. Because if you can imagine hearing about somebody in another oppressive system, turning around, finally losing the rag, not being able to take anymore, imagine somebody in a gulag, for example. We wouldn't look at that person and call them a serial killer. We wouldn't remember them in that way. We would understand and place their actions within their proper context. And that's the reason why Eileen Wuornos is so unfairly maligned.
Okay. I'm wondering, because there's a lot of comments in the chat. There's no question, but I was wondering if you would take 1 or 2 questions if you have the time.
Yeah.
I'm going to let the audience formulate any questions they might have. But in the meantime, if you didn't have the time to stay through it all, or if you want to send this video to someone, for the viewers, we usually pin the interviews on our Facebook profile. And we also have a YouTube channel where we have also interviewed the previous women. So feel free to share, to connect through there. I don't see any question for now. Okay, I was wondering, in the meantime, do you have any last words that you would like to share with our predominantly women audience?
Oh God, yeah. I suppose I'd like to say that what has happened, what's been done here in the last 10 years or so, since the survivor voice has gotten very, very loud. I mean, sex trade survivors have been speaking out long before I was. Fiona's about 25 years speaking out. I know women in America who are 30 years and longer. So this is not a new thing, but it's gotten very, very strong, like I said at the beginning of our interview, over the last decade. And unfortunately, one of the things that's happened within that is that people who really would not like to see us achieve our political goals have pitted women against each other. They've created this situation where you have the, sex trade survivors here and the happy sex workers there, and you can't agree or believe in one without dismissing and ignoring the other. And that's that kind of ugly dichotomy that we've ended up with. But what I'd like women listening to remember is that, as Catherine McKinnon said, we're not talking about two different populations here. We're talking about the same population at two different moments in time. And I know that it's perfectly possible. It's actually frighteningly possible that I could have, in my own life, been a very loud, very angry, very defensive, strident sex workers' rights activist. And I'm telling you now, I wouldn't want to meet myself coming in the other direction, you know what I mean? Because I know how angry I would have been. And I know that I would have been boiling with rage and justifiable rage, mind you, because I hadn't asked to be shoved into the role that society shoved me into. I didn't ask for unwell parents or, any of the rest of that stuff that brought me to that place. So I would have been very, very angry, and I would have been especially angry if I came across middle-class women or women who are socially privileged in any kind of way. So, and I gave an interview years ago, when I was about 16 or 17 at the time. I gave an interview to a journalist, and I just spoke some nonsense, and I told her that I didn't give a shite what anybody thought of me and blah, blah, blah. It was all a load of nonsense. But I was protecting myself, So what I would say to women is, young feminists in particular, don't be bamboozled by this idea that you have to be disrespectful or dismissive towards women who are in prostitution just because you know that the system they're caught up in shouldn't exist. Because there is a difference between stigmatizing an individual and stigmatizing an institution. So I would ask them to bear that in mind.
Mm-hmm. To keep also in mind that the grassroots and the theory are they're very connected, but very different realities, and that they need to feed one another, right?
Well, that's a whole other conversation. We could talk for another half an hour on that, I suppose. But thank you very much for your time, Adriana. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being here with us tonight, and I'm sending a lot of strength from Belgium. No words I could use would be enough. So thank you so much, and thank you for talking with us and sending the clear message to women in general.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye. Have a great night.